You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is episode 48. And this is your host, Brian McClanahan. This covers the week of October 24th through October 28th, 2016. Glad to have you back on the program. Before we get started with the material for the week, just want to remind everyone that we are a nonprofit organization that exists on your generous contributions alone. So if you like this podcast, please make a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. You can do so at our website, abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, go to the Support tab and click on Memberships for Individuals. And there you'll find various levels for donating, anything from $50 up to as much as you want. So we'd love to have your support, help keep this podcast, the website, our programs going. We have a lot of great things that we want to do, but of course those things take money. And so anything you can do to help us out, any little bit you can do to help us out, there is even a button to donate less than $50 if you would like to. If that's all you got, we'll take it. So and we'll be appreciative of it. So please consider a donation to the Abbeville Institute. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow our YouTube channel. We will be putting more material up there as we have it. And so spread the word. If you are a social media fanatic, share our articles. Do those type of things to help us explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition and to persuade others that the South has a lot to offer. It's not just race and slavery, as everyone, of course, in the mainstream would like to suggest. And even on our social media pages, people sometimes stupidly put those things up there as we're talking about something else completely. But your support in every way helps us keep the mission of the Abbeville Institute alive. Okay, so that said, let's talk about the material for the week. We had a very eclectic week, and we had a little bit of Southern culture and a little bit of politics, a little bit of agrarianism, so a little bit of history. And we do that in some weeks, but this week we started the week with a piece by Terry Halsey. It was a book review of Jack Henson's One Man War. And this book has sold very well since it came out in 2009, so it's been out now for a little bit of time. But if you're not familiar with the story of Jack Hinson was from Tennessee, and his sons were killed and then beheaded, and their heads were stuck up on fence posts on Jack Hinson's farm. Now, Jack Hinson wasn't really much of a secessionist. He had a pretty large farm in Tennessee. His sons were clearly in favor of secession, and the problem was that in this area of Tennessee, the Union Army considered the native Southern population to be a detriment to controlling the region because there was some quote-unquote bushwhacking operations that went on in that area. And so his sons fell prey to a Union detachment who decided that these guys who were out hunting needed to be killed, and that forced Jack Hinson's hand. A man who had never raised a hand against a Union soldier decided that he was going to order a sniper rifle and he was going to do some damage, and he did quite extensively. And so he killed more than 100 people, 100 soldiers in the Union Army, and this was all through sniping operations. He'd shoot them on riverboats, wherever he could. He was going to take out as many Union soldiers who did his family harm as he could. And, of course, his farm was destroyed. Everywhere around Tennessee was being ransacked in the area where Hinson lived. So what this book does is give you a much more complex look at the war on the home front. Sometimes we get a very cartoonish look at just about every war in American history, and I think that's unfortunate. But, you look at the American War for Independence, and we think, there wasn't really a whole lot of nastiness about that war. But if you really read into it, it was a very nasty conflict. And the same thing with of course, the war between the states, the war for Southern independence, which is a better way to put it. You've got Union soldiers occupying areas of the South, and they're doing some real damage to the civilian population. They're doing some real damage to the infrastructure and the farms and other things around these areas. So this was a nasty war, and Southerners suffered severely because of it. Now, even to this day, and if you go on social media, there are people that proudly will say this, oh yeah, those treasonous Southerners deserved it. This is unprecedented, really. These are Americans we're talking about who had a different opinion about the nature of federal power and how far it could go, and they exercised their right to self-determination. And even to this day, you have people who think that this is a glorious thing that the South got stuck to them. The reconciliation that we once had at the end of the war into the early 20th century, as we've talked about in this podcast, is long gone. And I think that's very troubling and also sad, because for years Americans thought that the South had a point. Legally, politically, they just lost. And Southern heroes were also American heroes. Robert E. Lee was an American hero. Stonewall Jackson was an American hero. And it's only, say, in the last 50 years that position, maybe even less, that position has begun to turn in the other way. What's happened is that spirit of friendship, again, reconciliation, that dominated really the 1880s into the even in the 1940s is gone. And so we've gone back to the kind of vitriol that we found the North exercising during the war and immediately after during Reconstruction. That has come back. And so it's not surprising that books like this would be swept under the carpet. Now, it's a great selling book. A lot of people have bought it, and you can get it, of course, at Amazon or anywhere books are sold. I'm not so certain. I've seen it really in many bookstores, but you can definitely buy it online. And it's definitely worth the money to put down for it. It's not an expensive book, but it's definitely worth the Andrew Jackson you might have to spend to purchase the book. But it does give a much more complex view of the war and what was at stake for many Southerners and why Union atrocities would move men to do things. Again, Hinson was not interested in the war. He was interested in being a farmer. But the Union forced his hand, and I think this was the case for a lot of Southern soldiers, as people like James McPherson and others have pointed out, why they fought. It wasn't for any thing that, of course, many people would say it was for. A lot of people fought because they just were defending hearth and home. If the Yankees would stop fighting them, they'd stop fighting back. And Hinson, I think, clearly shows that. So this is a great little review. It's not a long piece, but it's worth your time to read it. On Tuesday, we published a poem. Now, we do this every now and then. This is a poem by Mark Mantle, and Mark Mantle's new to the website. He's a lawyer from Richmond, Virginia. He's actually born in Russia, but he found the Southern tradition appealing because of its continuity with European conservatism and European culture. And that's very important. It's something that we don't often talk about, but the South, one of the things that made the South so interesting, I think Southern culture so interesting, is that it really did hold on to this old Western civilization tradition of the Greeks and the Romans and Christianity longer than anywhere else. And you had two views of republicanism. You had two views of, what it meant to be a conservative moving forward, one Southern, one Northern. And as the North became radicalized, as the North pursued their vision of what it meant to have federal power, the North wanted to secede more than the South did, oftentimes, all throughout American history. You look at the earliest secession movements, 1794, 1800, 1803, 1815, 1848. Northerners were pushing secession more than Southerners. And that's because they couldn't get what they wanted through national power, what they thought was national power. If they couldn't get the type of political economy they wanted, the society they wanted. Through national power, they just wanted out. The South pursued secession for a different reason. Jefferson was a reformer, but only in Virginia. Only in Virginia. He wasn't a reformer for South Carolina or for Pennsylvania or New York. He was only a reformer in Virginia. To Southerners, there was a firm commitment to federalism. Northerners could do what they wanted in their own state. If they wanted to reform in Massachusetts, they could, or in a Midwestern state. And Calhoun made this clear in his speech on the admission of Michigan as a state. Northerners could do what they wanted in their own backyard, and Southerners believed the exact same thing. But when it came to quote-unquote national power, that's where there was a split. And so Southerners were pursuing a different type of republicanism than Northerners. A different type of federalism than Northerners. A different type of power than Northerners. And a lot of that had to do with culture. And so when you look at Southern culture, it was a continuation of all the things that had made Europe exceptional. Different places in Europe exceptional. For a time, Greece was exceptional. For a time, Rome was exceptional. For a time, Great Britain was exceptional. And so when you look at that perspective, the South held on to that stuff longer. And so when you have people who study the Southern tradition, and they find it appealing because they say, it's the South is resisting innovations. And that's the thing that made the South unique. Southerners studied the Greek and Roman classics. I was just reading, and I'm going to write a review on this book, great, wonderful book on Philip Pendleton Barber, who was really very much an unknown, but very important Virginian. And he was a Jeffersonian, an old Republican, part of that group in the early 19th century, who later, became a Supreme Court justice. He served in the Congress and was John Randolph of Roanoke thought he was a wonderful adversary, and when they had to battle it out every now and then, and also he thought he was one of the best orators in the Congress, and that's saying a lot coming from Randolph. And they saw eye to eye on most issues. But the thing about Barber is that he was, now all Virginians, they were all classically educated, and Barber loved Roman history, and his entire life, if you look at the names of his children, they're all named after they have Latin names, and his plantation was named for a Roman wine producing region. He just enjoyed this classical history and its influence on Western civilization. And so when you look at that, and of course their Christianity, and this is discussed in the book, was a little different than the evangelical nature that was sweeping, during the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening in the South. They were Orthodox. They were very concerned about this process, and so that type of conservatism is appealing to a lot of people, even to this day, because of its reliance on the old parts of Western civilization. And so this little poem has that to it. It's that type of reverence for the past. Not because we just wanted to admire the past, but because of tradition. Oh, let his stone frown roll, applaud the silvery horse's scuttle, forget where granite hooves dwell. It's decreed, friends, ancient sorrows shan't tell. Forget a fallen, slandered father? What scary idol sings the dead man our children? Besiege the bewhiskered one blushing for us? Our grim storyteller, too, not like us. It's amnesiacs down the obedient horseman as memories into tiny tumblers fall. Idiotic smiles shade his sedimentary sword, and they can't even mimic the dead bronze lord. Oh, one mouthing crowd disputes the gray fragments, another bashes the stately old street. Yet where else to glimpse centuries blow past, as life buzzes on, so sweet. On Wednesday, we ran another great piece by Clyde Wilson, Lincoln Follies, and this gets into the destruction of real conservatism again in the 1980s. That's really the period where things began to turn, and Clyde begins by talking about how, for a time, the pre-Reagan conservatives remembered that when the Washington Times was founded, they thought, well, this is going to be a great thing because we're going to have a real voice. And the first editorial page editor, William Cheshire, quit because he just saw the Washington Times becoming another neoconservative organ. Now, Clyde was actually offered a job as an editorial writer, and he turned it down, still continued to work in South Carolina, and thankfully for me that was the case, but the job went to Sam Francis instead, and Sam produced a lot of great material. But, of course, they also fired him because he was not necessarily in line with the neoconservative boilerplate, as Clyde says. And so he brings up the fact that now the Washington Times is just a completely, neoconservative rag, and they ran a piece. This piece is a little older. They ran a piece about Abraham Lincoln. And, of course, you have a point now where the conservatives are deciding, the neoconservatives are deciding that Lincoln is their guy. And this is exactly why Mel Bradford was not offered a position in the Reagan administration, because he had written disparaging things about Abraham Lincoln, and Bill Bennett and the Crystals and others, George Will, they went gaga over this. How can you have this guy who doesn't worship Abraham Lincoln? And this is exactly what we have. And he says, there follows a long barf-making quotation from Carl Sandburg, whose name is misspelled, by the way, which illustrates the folly of our pervasive Lincoln worship better than any critic can possibly do. Quote, "Not often in the story of mankind does a man arrive on earth who is both steel and velvet, who is hard as a rock and as soft as drifting fog, who holds in his heart and mind the paradox of terrible storm and peace unspeakable and perfect." And that's supposed to be Abraham Lincoln, by the way. And, of course, the editorial concludes, "Thank God for Abraham Lincoln. May our nation always be worthy of him." And Clyde says, well, Mr. Washington Times pundit, the way things are going, you don't have to worry about that. And this is a little piece that talks about the founding generation, the actual dichotomy between Lincoln and the founding generation and the founding tradition. So, again, it's amazing how Lincoln has become the symbol of American conservatism, when Lincoln himself, other than this proposed Ward who quote-unquote saved the Union, wasn't very conservative at all. And is that even conservative? Is that American conservatism? Is that Jeffersonian conservatism? Well, obviously it's not. His commitment to decentralization and federalism in the original Constitution was nil. And so this is where you really get this interesting debate. And I just wish, it's unfortunate that this debate, oftentimes our side gets silenced because the other side just can't stand it. There are too many anti-intellectual, quote-unquote, intellectuals out there who don't want any opposition to their opinion and can't stand it when a different perspective is offered. It's just silenced. And this is not just on the left. The neoconservatives are terrible with it. In fact, I think sometimes they're worse. No dissent is tolerated. Now, that said, on Thursday we ran another piece by Herrick Kimball. We're running a lot of pieces by Kimball because he has a lot of great stuff on his old Deliberate Agrarian website. He's actually moved to a new website, and he has a family-based business on a farm, and so we want to, he's actually in New York, but he loves the Jeffersonian tradition, and we want to promote someone who lives that life. And this is a really interesting piece because he gets into the economic downturn that's inevitable. It's going to happen at some point. He talks about what you should do to prepare. This is what he calls agrarian-style economic self-defense. He says, if you live near a city or a high population center, get out. He says it's clear that in the Great Depression, those people were not in good shape. Buy land or get some land in a rural area where you can fend for yourself. You need to be able to plant a garden, raise a few chickens, hunt, fish, trap, and forage for wild edibles. And he says, I'll take fields and forests over city dumpsters any day. Eliminate debt. Don't be dependent on the industrial matrix. Start putting your hands to work. Do more for yourself. Be creative. Learn some basic manual skills like gardening, sewing, cooking from scratch, woodworking. Become self-sufficient. This is actually the key to everything. We've talked about it on this podcast, but personal independence. You can't have political independence if you can't be personally independent. And it's a very hard thing to do for most of us because we're not trained in that manner anymore. But you have to be independent in some way to be politically independent. And this is where you should think locally and act locally. Worry about hearth and home first, then your community. And he actually mentions here, find a community and get involved. Get yourself in a small rural church. Think about community. Have some people that think like you around you so they can help you out. You can help each other out. Now, they're not going to pay your mortgage for you, but you know what? They have a little extra food or some extra clothes or something you might need. They might help you out. That's more important. That think locally, act locally attitude is more important for our future than anything else. We can talk about what we should do with the general government. I'm going to tell you, unless you have people that are willing to do these type of things to be more independent, nothing's ever going to change. The states are as dependent on federal cash as anything else. Most people are dependent on federal cash. So unless you can do those things, you're in trouble. So this is a nice little primer on that basic idea: self-reliance, self-responsibility, independence. There are a few things that we can all do to try to have that perspective, but he's very correct on this. Most importantly, think independence for yourself and your family. Get off of the state in whatever way you can do it, and it's not easy. Get your tools that you need to maintain yourself, and stock up on some basic food items. These are things that everyone can do to try to have a little more self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency breeds an independent spirit because you don't need anyone else. So this is a great little piece, very short, but it goes hand in hand with his position on the family farm and the family economy. And last but not least, a little bit of culture again to end the week. It's a little piece by yours truly on Charlie Daniels. He turned 80 on Friday. And again, still producing great music, still touring. He's really an iconic symbol of the South and the Southern musical tradition. Most people are familiar with his major hits. But he had a long career. Daniels started... Now, I would be remiss, one thing, and I thought about putting this in the piece because I knew I would immediately get an email from Clyde Wilson saying, you didn't mention Charlie Daniels from North Carolina. Right, he is from North Carolina. He lives in Tennessee now. He is from North Carolina. And I thought about putting that in there because I knew I would get an email if I didn't say that. But I didn't. I just said he had a ranch in Tennessee. So, but he is from North Carolina. And, of course, Clyde Wilson, being from North Carolina, wants everyone to know that North Carolina is an important part of Southern and American history. And so Daniels' career begins really in the early 1960s. He was playing as a background musician, writing tunes. Elvis actually recorded one of his tunes. And then by the 1970s, he was part of this Southern cultural revival. And he helped found Capricorn Studios in Macon, Georgia. Really what happens here in that 1970s period is the South had been vilified for the 20 years prior. And Southerners are starting to say, wait a second here. The South has something to offer. And everyone knew it in the South. Everyone knew Southerners had been the backbone of America. The Southern agrarian tradition. I mean, this is what Daniels is singing about. If you listen to tunes that he wrote about, if you listen to tunes like Tennessee or Georgia or Carolina, I Remember You, these are tunes that exemplify the South and really promote that Southern tradition. And so I put a few lesser-known tunes on this piece, all the way up from his earliest solo effort, came from the album called Charlie Daniels, to his most recent effort, which is a cowboy record. He went out and recorded some of his earlier songs like Billy the Kid, which is a great tune, but he made it into a campfire song, basically. It's really interesting. So go out there and listen to some of those tunes. There's also one that is from a radio program called Super Jam, which came out in 1978. Wish you had these things today, but it brought together Dickie Betts, the remaining members from Leonard Skinner, the Plane Crashers, just about a year before that, and Charlie Daniels, and they played a bunch of tunes. And one of the tunes I put on there is Southbound, which the Allman Brothers Band, of course, recorded, but it's a great version of that tune, and it's highly worth your time to listen to it. Okay, so that's it for the week. We've got another great week coming up next week. We are winding down for the year, but November starts our real push for our contributions, year-end contributions. The end of the year is coming up. If you think about making tax plans, it is non-profit organization month, the month of November, so you are going to see some communication from us. We'd love to have your support in that month. And again, with the end of the year coming up, if you're trying to get as much out of the way as you can, so you don't have to pay Uncle Sam too much in taxes, you can put that to a good cause, which is helping the Abbeville Institute explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. So until next time, good day.